There is a book that used to sit inside the Bible, printed, bound, read from pulpits, quoted by kings. And in one short chapter of that book, somebody wrote down the name of the place where the 10 lost tribes of Israel went. Not a theory, not a guess, a name. One word, a Hebrew word so strange that most translators never really knew what to do with it. And then, a little over 200 years ago, that entire book quietly disappeared from almost every Bible printed in America. Tonight, I am going to tell you that word. But not yet, because here is what is coming in the next few minutes. I am going to show you the hidden Hebrew phrase buried underneath that name and what it literally means. I am going to show you why the book that contains it was pushed out of the Bible and who made that decision and when. And, near the end, I am going to ask you a question about your own family's memory that you may not be able to answer. Stay with me. It gets stranger than you think. Let's start with the disappearance itself, because a lot of people have heard the phrase, the 10 lost tribes, and almost nobody has been told what actually happened. Around the year 722 BC, there was a city called Samaria in the hill country of what is now the northern West Bank. It was the capital of a kingdom, not Judah in the south, with Jerusalem and the temple, but the other one, the northern kingdom, 10 tribes with their own kings, their own shrines, their own army. And it sat directly in the path of the most efficient war machine the ancient Near East had ever produced, Assyria. The Assyrians did not simply conquer, they engineered. Their signature policy was mass deportation, and it was surgical. You take a defeated population, you break it into pieces, you march those pieces hundreds of miles across the empire, and you settle them among strangers who do not speak their language. Then you move another conquered people into the land you just emptied. Do that as national policy for 200 years, and you dissolve entire nations into the population of an empire. The siege of Samaria lasted roughly 3 years. The biblical text credits a king named Shalmaneser. Assyrian records credit his successor, Sargon II, who claimed the victory in his own royal annals. And in those annals, carved into stone at his palace, there is a number. 27,290. That is how many people he says he carried away. Scholars still argue over whether that counts the whole population or only the elite. But the number is not the point. The point is what comes next. The biblical text tells us exactly where they were taken. Hala, Habor, by the river Gozan, the cities of the Medes. Those are real places, northern Mesopotamia, the Habur River Valley in what is now northeastern Syria, and eastward into the Zagros Mountains of western Iran. And then? Then nothing. No exile chronicle, no prophet writing home, no return. Judah, the southern kingdom, went into exile in Babylon 130 years later, and Judah came back. We have the names, we have the census lists. The northern 10 tribes never came back. They do not vanish in a puff of smoke. They vanish the way people actually vanish in history, slowly and administratively. A generation stops using the old names. A generation after that stops speaking the old language at home. A generation after that has a grandmother's story and no way to check it. And that silence has been sitting there for 27 centuries. Quick question before we go further, and I want you to answer this one in the comments. Do you think a population that large can genuinely disappear? Or do you think they were absorbed and we simply lost the ability to see them? Hold that thought, because there is one ancient text that refuses to leave it at silence. One text that says, no, they did not just melt into the empire, they left, on purpose, together, and it names the destination. The book is called 2nd Esdras. If you grew up with an American Protestant Bible, you have almost certainly never seen it. If you grew up Catholic, you may have seen it in an appendix. If you grew up Ethiopian Orthodox, you may know it by a completely different name, and we will come back to that. Scholars usually call the core of it 4th Ezra. Chapters 3 through 14 are a Jewish apocalyptic work that most researchers date to the end of the 1st century after Christ, roughly a generation after Roman legions burned the Second Temple. And that timing is everything. Picture the world this author is writing in. The temple is ash. Jerusalem is a Roman construction site. The priesthood is finished. And a Jewish writer, grieving and furious, does what apocalyptic writers did. He tells his own crisis through the voice of a hero from the past. The voice he chooses is Ezra. The historical Ezra was a scribe and a priest of the 5th century BC who came up from the Babylonian exile with a Persian mandate: rebuild the community, restore the law, put the pieces back together. The author picked the one figure in the tradition whose job was recovering what was lost. And in this book, Ezra does not lecture, he argues. He asks what people are not supposed to ask out loud. Why do the wicked prosper? Why did God let this happen? Here is something else you should know, and it is going to matter later. The original Hebrew version is gone, lost. What survives came to us in Latin, in Syriac, in Ethiopic, in Armenian, in Arabic, in Georgian, carried for centuries by communities scattered from the Nile to the Caucasus. Think about what that means. This text was preserved almost everywhere except the place it was written. And then we reach chapter 13. Ezra has a vision. He sees something rise out of a churning sea, the figure of a man. Wherever this figure looks, everything under his gaze trembles. An enormous multitude gathers from the four winds of heaven to make war on him, and he destroys them, not with a sword, but with the words of his own mouth. And then, when the battlefield is empty, Ezra sees a second crowd approaching, a peaceful one. They are not armed. They come to him. And Ezra, being Ezra, asks the obvious question: who are these people? The answer he is given is the reason this video exists. These are the 10 tribes, the ones carried away out of their own land, the text says, in the days of Hosea the king, when the king of Assyria took them captive. And then the text does something no other ancient source does. It tells you they made a decision, as a body, to leave, to walk away from the empire entirely, and go somewhere no one had ever been. And it tells you the name of the place they went. I am going to say that name in about 90 seconds, but if I say it now, without the language underneath it, you will hear a noise instead of a clue, and the clue is the entire point. So here is what the text says they did. They took counsel among themselves. That is the language, a collective decision. They agreed to leave the nations behind and travel into a far country where no human being had ever lived. Why? The text gives a reason, and it is a brutally honest one. They went there, it says, so that they could finally keep the commandments they had never kept while they were home. That is not a triumphant reason. That is a confession. This is a text saying our ancestors failed, and their answer to failure was distance. They entered the Euphrates, it says, at the narrow passages of the river. They crossed, and the journey through that country took them 1.5 years. And the name of that region, the text says, is Arzareth. Arzareth. Say it slowly. Arzareth. In the Latin manuscripts, it appears as a proper noun, sitting in the sentence exactly the way Egypt or Assyria would sit, a place, a destination, something you could theoretically walk to. And for centuries, that is how European readers took it. Map makers hunted for it. Travelers claimed to have found it. But Arzareth is not a Latin word. It is not a Greek word. It is a Hebrew phrase that has been crushed into a single unit and then carried through 3 or 4 languages by scribes who did not speak it. Pull it apart, and you get 2 words. Eretz, pronounced eretz. It is one of the most common nouns in the entire Hebrew Bible. It means land, earth, territory, country. It is the word in the very first sentence of Genesis when God creates the heavens and the eretz. Aheret, pronounced ahe, it means other, another, different. Put them together, eretz aheret, another land. That's it. That's the whole secret. The mysterious name of the mysterious country where the 10 tribes are supposed to have gone is not a name at all. It is a description. It means quite literally, somewhere else. Now hold on, because this is the part that made me sit up when I first traced it. That phrase is not invented. It's a quotation. It comes out of the book of Deuteronomy in a passage where Israel is warned about what will happen if the covenant is broken. The people will be uprooted from their soil in anger and fury, and thrown, the Hebrew verb is violent, thrown into another land, Eretz Acheret. And the passage ends with 3 words that will keep you up at night if you sit with them long enough. As it is this day. So look at what the author of this vision has done. He has reached back into the law of Moses, taken the exact phrase that describes the punishment, another land, and turned it into a place name. He has taken a threat and given it geography. He has taken an ending and made it an address, which means the name is doing double duty. Read one way, it is a location. Read the other way, it is a verdict quoted from Deuteronomy and sealed onto the map. That is an astonishing piece of writing, and it's completely invisible unless you know the Hebrew. So why does almost nobody know this? Partly because of what happens in translation. When a translator hits Arzareth, he has 3 options, and all 3 of them lose something. He can leave it as Arzareth, which is faithful and which tells the average reader absolutely nothing. He can translate the meaning, which some ancient Syriac readings effectively do. They render it as another land, which erases the name completely so the reader never suspects there was one. Or he can assume a copying error and correct it, which some Latin manuscript traditions did, producing readings like Ararat, a real place, and almost certainly not what the author wrote. 3 roads out, every one of them buries the clue. And that's before we get to the fact that in almost no Bibles printed in the United States today, the sentence doesn't appear at all, because the book is not in there. Let me stay with that journey for a minute, because the details are where the historians start earning their paychecks. The crossing point is the Euphrates, at what the text calls the narrow passages. That is not a vague statement. In its lower stretches, the Euphrates is broad and slow and thoroughly unhelpful if you are trying to move a population on foot. But go north, into the highlands of what is now southeastern Turkey, and the river runs through gorges, and there are fords that armies and caravans used for thousands of years. A group moving out of the Assyrian resettlement zones, away from imperial control, would have had exactly those options, north and west into the Anatolian highlands, or north and east through the mountain corridors toward the Caucasus and the steppe beyond. And what is beyond? In the ancient imagination, and in a fair amount of ancient reality, what is beyond is emptiness. Grassland that runs for 1,000 miles, the great corridor that the Scythians rode and the Silk Road would later thread through, territory the empires of Mesopotamia knew about, feared, and never held, a land where, from an Assyrian scribe's point of view, nobody lived. And 1.5 years on foot is not a migration to the next province. It is the kind of distance that puts a mountain range and a desert between you and the people who deported you. Let me be careful here, because this is where these stories usually go off the rails. There is no archaeological site labeled Arzareth, no inscription, no ruin, no dig with a signboard. What we have is a text written centuries after the events it describes, in a genre that was never trying to be journalism. But here is what we also have. Assyrian records confirming the deportations were real and enormous and directed exactly where the Bible says they were directed. Archaeological evidence of a northern kingdom that materially stops being a northern kingdom. And communities scattered across the Caucasus, Central Asia, and Northeast Africa whose Jewish presence is so old that the origin story is genuinely contested by serious scholars. So the question is not whether people moved. People definitely moved. The question is whether one ancient author preserved a real memory of where some of them went, or whether he was writing hope in the shape of a map. Which is exactly why the next part is so strange, because if this book raises a legitimate historical question, why is it so hard to find? Second Esdras was not always obscure. It was widely read in the early church. Church fathers quoted it. Portions of it are still recited in some Western liturgies to this day. There are prayers in use right now whose wording comes out of this book, said by people who have no idea where the words came from. So how did it end up outside the fence? The honest answer has several parts, and I'm going to give you all of them, including the boring ones. Part 1 is language. The Hebrew original was lost early, and for the rabbinic tradition, a book without a Hebrew text and without a claim to the age of the prophets simply did not qualify. That is not a conspiracy, that is a filing rule, applied consistently. Part 2 is Jerome. When he produced the Latin Vulgate in the late 4th century, he was openly skeptical of books outside the Hebrew canon. Second Esdras was pushed to the margins, and later Latin Bibles printed it in an appendix after the New Testament, outside the main body. Not destroyed, demoted. Part 3 is the Reformation. In 1546, the Council of Trent produced a definitive list of canonical books for the Catholic Church, and Second Esdras was not on it. The Protestant reformers working from the Hebrew canon made their own cut and grouped this material as apocrypha, a word that means hidden or set aside. And here's the detail most people find genuinely shocking. The original King James Bible of 1611 contained the apocrypha. It was printed, bound, and sold with it. The book we are discussing was in it. What removed it was not a council and not a decree. It was economics. In the early 19th century, the British and Foreign Bible Society, the largest Bible printer and distributor on earth at the time, went through a bitter internal fight over whether to keep funding Bibles that contained the Apocrypha. In 1826, they resolved not to. Cheaper to print, fewer arguments. And within a couple of generations, an entire English-speaking world grew up holding a book it believed had always looked that way. So, was it suppression? Or was it housekeeping? I think reasonable people land in different places on that. You can call it a series of defensible institutional decisions made over 1,400 years. You can also notice that the cumulative effect was the disappearance of the one ancient text that names a destination for the 10 tribes. Both of those sentences are true at the same time. That is what makes this interesting instead of easy. Tell me in the comments which one you lean toward, and be specific, because I would rather read one good argument than 100 one-word verdicts. And now the detail I promised you earlier, the one that changes the shape of this whole conversation. Second Esdras never left every Bible. In the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo tradition, this material survives under the name Ezra Sutuel, inside one of the broadest scriptural collections in the Christian world. In parts of the Slavonic tradition, it survives as well. So the book that vanished from American bookshelves has been sitting on the shelf in Ethiopia the entire time, in Ge'ez, copied by hand, generation after generation, while Europe was still arguing about whether it counted. The line of transmission for one of the most tantalizing texts about the lost tribes of Israel runs straight through Northeast Africa, and that is not speculation, that is manuscript history. Which brings us to something even harder to explain away. Set 2nd Esdras aside for a moment. Close it. Pretend you never heard of it. Now open a standard Bible, any translation, any hotel drawer in America, and read what the canonical prophets say about the northern tribes after they are gone. Because they do not say the tribes were destroyed. They say the opposite, repeatedly, in text that no council ever removed. Jeremiah speaks of gathering people from the northern country and from the far corners of the earth, and he specifically includes the blind, the lame, the pregnant woman, the woman in labor. That is not the language of a symbolic remnant. That is the language of a real population that has been living and having children somewhere for a very long time. Amos gives us the most haunting image of all. He describes Israel being sifted among all nations the way grain is sifted in a sieve, shaken violently, scattered thoroughly. And then he adds the line that does the real work. Not the smallest grain shall fall to the ground. Sifted everywhere. Lost by us, not lost by the one doing the sifting. And Ezekiel is handed 2 sticks, one for Judah and one for Joseph, and told to hold them together in his hand until they become one. A prophecy that only makes sense if, at the time it was given, the second group still existed somewhere to be joined back on. Now put the 2 sources side by side. The canonical prophets, they are scattered, they are kept, they will be gathered from the ends of the earth. The book that was removed, here is the river they crossed, here is how long it took, here is what the region is called. One set of texts tells you that they exist, the other tells you where to point. I am not going to oversell this. There is a perfectly ordinary explanation available. The author knew the prophets intimately. He was writing inside that tradition, and a good writer working inside a tradition will naturally produce something that fits it. That is not a conspiracy. That is literacy. But there is also a version where a first-century Jewish author, sitting in the rubble of the temple, preserved a fragment of memory older than himself. I cannot prove that version. I also cannot make the ordinary explanation account for why he chose that specific phrase from Deuteronomy and welded it into a place name. That is a very deliberate thing to do. Which leaves us with the question this whole video has been walking toward. If Arzareth was a real region, if any part of this describes something that actually happened, then those people had children, and their children had children, and that line did not stop. Populations do not evaporate. That is not a thing that happens in history. Populations assimilate. They intermarry. They lose a language in 2 generations and a name in 3. They keep a food custom without knowing why. They keep a burial practice, a Sabbath rhythm, a story a grandmother tells that nobody can source. They forget where they came from, and they keep doing the thing anyway. And across the world right now, there are communities who never accepted the idea that they were lost at all. There are Jewish communities in Ethiopia whose tradition traces them to the tribe of Dan. There is a widespread tradition among Pashtun tribes in Afghanistan and Pakistan of Israelite descent. There are communities in southern Africa with an oral history of a journey out of the north and practices that look unmistakably familiar to anyone who has read Leviticus. There are groups across West Africa, India, and the Americas making similar claims. I want to be straight with you about the evidence because you are not a child and I am not going to flatter you. Some of these traditions have received serious academic attention and the results are genuinely mixed and genuinely debated. Some rest almost entirely on oral history, and oral history is real evidence, but it is evidence historians handle with care. I am not going to tell you which of them is descended from whom, because I do not know, and neither does anyone with certainty. But I will say this. The reason so many separate peoples on 4 continents who never met each other ended up carrying a version of the same story is a real historical question nobody has fully answered. And that part is not in dispute. Assyria really did empty a kingdom. Those people really did go somewhere. They really did have descendants, and those descendants are alive somewhere on this planet right now, whether or not a single one of them knows it. So let me turn this around and hand it to you. What does your family remember that it cannot explain? I am not asking you to claim anything. I am not going to tell you which tribe you are, and if you have watched this channel for a while, you know I do not do that. I am asking a stranger question. Is there a custom in your family that came from nowhere? A word nobody can translate, a rule about food or mourning or a day of the week that your grandmother enforced and could never justify, and that her grandmother enforced before her? Most of the time, that's just family. Families are weird, that's what families are. But every one of those fragments is exactly what a lost history looks like from the inside. Not a document, not a monument, just a habit that outlived its own explanation. And that's what makes one Hebrew phrase buried in a deleted book so difficult to put down. Eretz Acharet, another land. Not a mystical realm, not a hidden dimension, just somewhere else. Somebody, almost 2,000 years ago, sat down in a ruined city and wrote that word because he could not accept that a third of his own people had simply ceased to exist. He may have been wrong about the geography. He was not wrong about the instinct. So here is where I leave it with you. And this is the part where I actually want to hear from you, because the comments section on this channel is consistently smarter than most of the sources I read. If Arzareth was a real place, where do you think it was? Give me your best case. The Caucasus corridor? The Central Asian steppe? Somewhere along the old trade roads into Africa or Arabia? Or do you think the author was writing a theological idea rather than a location, and Arzareth is a state of exile rather than a spot on a map? And the second question, which I think is the harder one, should Second Esdras have been removed? Not whether the decisions were defensible, whether it was the right call given what it contains. Make your case, disagree with each other in the replies. I will be down there reading. I also want to say thank you directly because this video exists because of you. This topic came from the comment section. A number of you over several videos kept asking about the book that got cut and what it actually said and why nobody talks about it. You asked for Arzareth by name, so this one is yours. And if you are the person who asked, say something in the comments so I can find you. If you want more of this, one word, one book, one thread pulled all the way to the end, subscribe and turn on the bell, because the next one goes deeper into the same territory. There are other texts that were cut. Some of them name names too. Thank you for staying to the end. I will see you in the next one.